The 62 sevens is a time to rebuild Jerusalem during the New Testament era. This rebuilding is a figure of the gospel going into the world via the church to save God's elect. But at the end of the 69th week, the church will fall away as the people of the prince forsake God's holy covenant. We begin in Daniel chapter 9, verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. What is the spiritual meaning of the word command? The word command refers to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which is a figure of God's law and covenant. According to Daniel chapter 6, the penalty for violating the law of the Medes and the Persians is death. For example, in Ezra chapter 6, verse 11, the penalty for disobeying or changing Darius' decree to rebuild the temple was death by hanging. In verse 11 we read, "Also I made a decree that is a command or covenant, that whosoever shall alter this word, let timber be pulled down from his house, and being set up, let him be hanged thereon, and let his house be made a dunghill for this." The word hang reminds us that Christ was hanged on a tree to suffer eternal damnation for the sins of his elect. Therefore, God is teaching us that anyone who interferes with his command to rebuild the temple will suffer eternal damnation. The question is, what is the spiritual meaning of rebuilding the temple? Well, we're going to learn that rebuilding the temple is akin to preaching the gospel of liberty to the captives of Satan and sin. We begin with Isaiah chapter 61, where God relates preaching the gospel of liberty with repairing and rebuilding the old waste and desolate places. In verse 1, we read, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound." Now it's important to remember that the captives were freed in 539 BC so that they could return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And that's precisely why verse 4 of Isaiah chapter 61 relates this time of preaching to building the old waste places. "And they shall build the old wastes. They shall rise up the former desolations, and they shall repair the waste cities, the desolations of many generations." Another important proof that preaching the gospel is related to building the waste places is found in Isaiah chapter 58. In verse 6 we read, "Is not this the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and to let the oppressed go free, and that ye break every yoke?" Interestingly, the word free is also found in Jeremiah chapter 34, verse 16, where God commanded Israel to free or to proclaim liberty to its captives at the end of every 7 years. In verse 14, we read, "At the end of 7 years, let ye go every man his brother and Hebrew, which hath been sold unto thee, and when he hath served thee 6 years, thou shalt let him go free from thee. But your fathers hearkened not unto me, neither inclined their ear." This rebellion of not obeying the command to free the captives every 7 years occurred just before the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and her temple in 587 BC. Consequently, Jerusalem and the temple were made desolate for 70 Sabbath years. However, when we go back to Isaiah chapter 58, we learn in verse 12 that if we obey the command to preach liberty to the captives, we will be used of God to rebuild and repair the old waste places and paths. And they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. Thou shalt raise up the foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in. The word paths indicate that the streets of Jerusalem will also be rebuilt. According to Jeremiah chapter 11 verse 6 and Jeremiah chapter 5 verse 1, the streets of Jerusalem are where we hear the covenant of God. It's where we hear truth. But prior to their restoration, the streets of Jerusalem was a place where Israel worshipped other gods, such as the Queen of Heaven. And as we learned in Revelation chapter 9 verse 20, these idols represent the worship of devils. And the only way that we can be free from the worship of Satan is through the preaching of the gospel of liberty, which frees us from Satan and sin. And so when we go back to Isaiah chapter 58, we learn that we preach this gospel during the sabbaths when we afflict our souls. So in verse 5, the question is this a day for a man to afflict his soul? And skipping down to verse 13, we read about the Sabbath. If thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord. Now we know that the phrase afflict our souls refers to the Day of Atonement, which is preceded by 7 7-year cycles of Sabbaths leading to the Jubilee year when we proclaim liberty to the captives. This language is found in Leviticus chapters 23 and 25. But as we learned in Jeremiah chapter 34, we also proclaim liberty at the end of every 7 years. But if we fail to observe these Sabbaths of 7 years, we too will be made desolate like Israel. And we learned some time ago that the Jubilee Sabbath year of 1994 is when the abomination of desolation was set up in the church, because she violated the Sabbaths by failing to preach a gospel that provides liberty from Satan and sin. And God used the 1,290 days of the abomination of desolation, spoken of in Daniel chapter 12 verse 11, to link the year 587 BC, when Israel was destroyed and made desolate by the Babylonians, to the year 1994. And we learned that this desolation was poured out over a period of 2,300 days because the church cast down the truth and the sanctuary. Consequently, Daniel chapters 8, 11, and 12 teach that God took away the daily candlestick of the church to indicate that she is no longer being used of God to evangelize the world because she forsook God's holy covenant. And that takes us back to Daniel chapter 9 in verse 26, where the phrase after 62 sevens refers to the end of the church age, when the church will not only forsake God's holy covenant, but also the prince of the covenant. There we read, and after 62 weeks, that is 62 sevens, shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. In other words, when we come to the 69th week, that is the end of the church age, the church will be flooded with false Christs and false prophets to such the degree that they will not only destroy the city and the sanctuary, but will cut off the prince of the covenant, that is Jesus Christ. And when we go to Daniel chapter 11, we see that the prince of the covenant is cut off during a flood when the church forsakes the covenant of the prince in favor of flatteries, that is, the false doctrines of the church. We begin in verse 21 of Daniel chapter 11. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, that is Satan the Antichrist, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And with an arm of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And so when we think about the church being flooded with false Christs and false prophets coming with signs and wonders, this passage informs us that they come in peaceably. And according to Daniel chapter 8, verse 25, Satan the Antichrist will destroy many by peace during the 2300 days, when the sanctuary and the truth is cast down because the church forsook God's holy covenant. As we consider this language in the light of the current disposition of the church, we see that most churches teach that Jesus loves you. He died for every person in the world. And all you have to do is accept him or be baptized in water. Other churches teach that God wants us to be prosperous. He wants us to be financially wealthy in this world. And to demonstrate that they have the authority of God, they come with false signs and miracles, speaking in tongues, dreams, visions, falling backwards. Now, of course, the majority of these manifestations are hoaxes. But every once in a while, Satan appears as an angel of light, the purpose being to deceive God's elect if it were possible. And so just as we learned that the preaching of the gospel of liberty is akin to repairing the waste places, God is teaching us that teaching false doctrine and engaging in false miracles is akin to destroying the city and the sanctuary. And that's precisely why in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus warned that the destruction of the temple was a sign of his coming and the end of the world. In verse 2 of Matthew chapter 24, we read, And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat up on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? Jesus goes on to explain that the signs of his coming is a time when there will be many false Christs and false prophets coming with signs and wonders. And the zenith of this time of deception is the abomination of desolation in the holy place. In verse 15 we read, When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. And so we're not surprised to find in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, that the abomination of desolation is a time when oblation will cease, meaning that the daily sacrifice would be taken away for 2300 days because the church forsook God's holy covenant. In verse 27 we read, And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause sacrifice and oblation to cease, and the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. In other words, The daily sacrifice of the church is taken away at the end of 2300 days, that is, in the year 2000 AD, when the church was made fully desolate. And here in verse 27, God assures us that this desolation will continue until the consummation, when God will make a full end of those who forsook his holy covenant. But why does God say at the beginning of the verse that the covenant would be confirmed for 1 week? In verse 27 of Daniel chapter 9, we read, "And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, that is the whole 70th week." How exactly do we confirm the covenant? Well, when we go back to Daniel chapter 11, we learned that although some of understanding will fall, they will be strong so that they will not do wickedly against the covenant. There we read, "And as such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong." And the word strong is also translated as confirm or repair, in the sense that we repair the gates and the walls of Jerusalem, according to Nehemiah chapter 3. Returning to verse 33 of Daniel 11, we see that they will not forsake God's holy covenant because they are used to instruct many. "And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, and by captivity, and by spoil many days." In other words, we face the same level of opposition as did Joshua, Zerubbabel, Haggai, and Zechariah when they were strengthening and instructing the people while rebuilding the temple. And during that time, there were those who wanted to cleave to the Jews by offering to help rebuild the temple. And that's why Daniel chapter 11 verse 34 teaches that many will cleave to them with flatteries. And so if we're involved in churches that teach we can become saved by accepting Jesus, water baptism, or speaking in tongues, it's evidence that we're violating the 7-year cycles of the Great Tribulation sabbaths. In other words, we're no longer preaching the gospel of liberty to free the captives of Satan and sin. But on the other hand, after God's elect leave the church at the end of 2300 days, that is in the year 2000 AD, they will begin to keep the Day of Atonement Sabbaths. And we suspect that this will include 4 cycles of Sabbaths that began in the year 2000 AD and will continue to the last 7-year cycle, which began in the year 2021 and will end in 2028. We also learned in previous studies that the 70 to 80 years of Psalm chapter 90 verse 10 likely began in 1948 when Israel, the fig tree, became a nation, and will continue sometime between now and the year 2028. Lastly, we also considered the fact that the Temple of Jerusalem was rebuilt over a period of 23 years. That is from 539 BC, when King Cyrus issued the command to rebuild the temple, to the year 516 BC, when the temple was finished. And so, since we began to leave the church, that is Babylon, in the year 2000 AD, we must ask the question, will this time of rebuilding continue for 23 years, that is to the year 2023? Or will it continue all the way to the 80th year of the fig tree in 2028? But one thing is sure. Matthew chapter 24 verse 14 affirms that this gospel will go into all the world, and then